So, all right. So first, let's review what we did last class. Last class, we did many things, many non-trivial things. We defined the notion of proof systems. We stated the Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which itself is a very remarkable thing. And then we kind of sketched two different proofs of GFIT. Turing's proof was more along what we were doing, so we kind of dug into it a little. And Gödel's proof, I just sketched the main thing, how the proof goes, without much detail, just to give you a hint of what's going on in there. And today, what we're going to do is kind of review this proof system stuff a little bit more, and then talk about this magical thing in computing called self-recursion. All right? And self-recursion is something that is kind of at the core of most computer viruses. It allows you this ability to access your own code, right? It's at the core of many self-replication systems. And in the end, we'll look at Keen's recursion theorem, which is one form of self-recursion. Okay. So let's review what we did last class. So what is the significance of Gödel's theorem? Why was this such a big deal when it came about? And even now, why is it so important? I think the proof itself has many important things, but hold on 1 second. For me, for us, it introduces several ideas which you are going to see many other places later on. The first idea is that proof is just a text or string whose meaning is given by the verifier. So what is a proof for me need not be a proof for you. What is a proof for you need not be a proof for somebody else, right? Depending on your mathematical sophistication, your familiarity with the subject, your level of proof requirements could be different, right? So proof is really just text whose meaning is given by the verifier. Now, just as we say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, really what we are saying is maybe truth is really in the eye of the verifier, right? You present a proof, if one verifier can accept it, another might not accept it. All right? So that's one of the main things that we kind of got into in the formalism of what it means to verify and prove statements. Okay? And the other thing is we actually have, in this day and age, many automated proof systems, right? And this idea of proof just being a text whose meaning is given by a verifier is not just a theoretical construct. There are really some startup companies which are trying to build these verifiers, which can build proofs and then check whether or not the proof works, right? So for instance, suppose I take this statement. Okay, this is just saying that there are infinite number of Pythagorean triples, a very standard statement, and I can say, okay, here's a proof for this statement. Okay, the quantified integer statement I wrote down is just saying that there are an infinite number of triples which satisfy the equation x squared plus y squared equals z squared. Okay, and I kind of cheated and wrote down a solution here. It doesn't matter for this specific statement. And the statement was, the proof is just, you take one specific assignment and check that it satisfies the assignment. Okay. So the proof is this text, and its meaning is given by a verifier, which we can think of as now being an algorithm, right? You check each equation line by line, following your axioms or principles, your propositional logic principles, and you at the end say, okay, this proof worked out, or there was a bug in this proof. Okay. So every proof is coming from this kind of an interpretation as given by the verifier. All right. Any questions about this? All right. And the second main idea, which we kind of hinted at in last class, is the chicken and egg question of what is truth versus proof. In fact, someone asked me in the office hours, Gödel's incompleteness theorem is saying that you cannot prove every statement. You cannot prove every true statement. But if you cannot prove it, what does it mean to say it is true even? Right? So which is coming first? Is the statement being true coming first, or there being a proof coming first? And it is precisely this issue which was pestering mathematicians for a long time that made people ask this question for many centuries. Right? They wanted to put things in a rigorous footing. Here are some axioms. I'm going to say 1 plus 1 equals 2, and then maybe some rules of inference, right? Something like A implies B, B implies C, implies A implies C, right? All such rules of propositional logic. Can I write down a finite list of rules, some axioms, and from there, every true statement should follow. Okay? That was the holy grail of science and math. You want to say that there's just some list of axioms and some rules of inference that we can take for granted. And once we have those, every true statement should follow. Right? I mean, for instance, people have been attempting this for many, many years. Right? People try to do this for Euclidean geometry, but then they found out that it's not complete. You can have non-Euclidean geometries which are still consistent, and so on. Okay? So let me say rules of inference could be propositional logic, first order logic, and so on. Okay? And there can be a lot of variety in these things. People in logic and in sciences have been very particular about what kind of rules we should allow and what kind of rules we should not allow, right? But for us, what we did is very remarkable, because we said you don't have to worry about what the precise rules are, and we just said they should be checkable by a Turing machine. Okay, this is the only constraint. If you think of propositional logic proofs that you might have seen in CS31 or something like that, they're definitely checkable by a computer. Okay? And what Gödel did was basically said, this nice clean picture of math and of sciences is not possible. The chicken and egg problem cannot be solved. You cannot say that, okay, here are my rules of inference, here are my axioms, from here on everything will follow. That is not going to work. You will have to keep revising your system of axioms as you go along. Okay? There are true statements which cannot be proved, no matter what rules you write down. Yeah? Yes, I'm talking about the rules of inference here more than the statements. You can think of any system, right? You can think of axioms and then logic, where you can say, okay, modus ponens, idempotent law, and all those things, right? You can use any application of those things. You can use principle of math induction, all of those things, but none of those is going to be able to prove all the things that you want. Okay? So that was a remarkable thing about Gödel. He said that no matter what you write down, you're not going to be complete. All right? So that's the big impact, of the the theorem. The chicken and egg question of what comes first, truth or proof, it's kind of really unanswerable. Okay? Finally, in the proof of the theorem, there was one idea that we also used, which is that if I had a complete verifier, then I can enumerate over solutions. I can enumerate over all possible proofs and actually solve the problem myself. Okay? This was the strict where, we said if V of F comma W equals 1, return 1. At the same time, we also said okay. So the crucial thing here was that we not only check for whether or not we found a proof for F, but we're always also checking for not of F, right? So this flip-flop between checking both the truth of the statement and the falsity of the statement is very critical in this argument. All right? Any questions about this? Yeah? Yeah. So we were iterating for all W. Okay. So these are the main three main things I think we should take away from Gödel's incompleteness theorem from our context. This notion of proofs as verifiers. Next, the chicken and egg question is not answerable. And finally, this idea that you can use verifiers themselves as subroutines to actually solve problems. Okay. And there was one missing ingredient that we didn't prove, which was this reduction, right? We said that the testing whether the UQIS function, which tests whether or not a given formula is true, is uncomputable, but I just stated it without proof. And the point there is that there is actually a reduction which reduces Turing machines to checking something about integers. Okay. In particular, there is a reduction which transforms a Turing machine to a formula such that the machine M halts on 0 if and only if the resulting formula is a true formula. Okay. This reduction is kind of complicated. We had to, I did cover it the last year, but this year I'm kind of pushing this under the rug to cover something else. Okay. The idea is you need to somehow encode the entire computation of a Turing machine as a sequence of integers and then make it into a statement about quantified, like a quantified integer statement. Right? So this is not something we are going to cover, but if you'd like to know more, reach out to me and I'll be happy to explain it beyond this class. Okay? So if we had this, then we are done with Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Right? These were the main things that we looked at in the last lecture. All right? Okay. So what I'm going to do today, or what I want to do today, is to cover another aspect of computability, which is self-recursion. Okay. And this is a little bit along the lines of how Gödel's original proof went, where he said, I'm going to find this statement G star, which is going to say that the statement itself is not provable, right? So somehow the statement talks about itself, right? It's talking about itself, meaning it has some self-recursive recursive properties, all right? So my goal today, or our goal today, is to just hint at this magical property of self-recursion. Okay. And I'll state Kleen's recursion theorem without proof. We'll see a proof of a special case of it. And once again, this theorem is at the core of many, many important things that we take for granted now. For instance, if you do any functional programming language, they all use some notion of self-recursion in them. Okay? All right. So jumping ahead, the main sort of the magic really is Kleen recursion theorem says something like the following. A Turing machine can access its own code for free. It sort of seems like a meaningless statement, right? How can a program access its own program code? Right? If you're a sci-fi fan, you can. This is a little bit like saying, can a machine manufacture itself? Hey, maybe someone will say, well, if you're a factory producing, can a factory produce a factory? A counter argument could be that to produce a machine, whatever is making the production should be more complicated. If I had to produce a car, I need a factory, which is presumably a more complicated thing than the car itself. Right? But at least in the context of programs, we'll see that that is not really true. There are programs which can refer to themselves. Right? So they can self-replicate. What is the foremost example of self-replication that you know of? Sure, we've been hearing about it all the time, right, in the last year. Well, virus, right? Why are they so nasty? They can self-replicate, right? So their code somehow, the genetic code has some cues for them to make copies of themselves, right? And computer viruses are exactly the same thing. And what we're going to do today is to kind of talk about such programs. Can a program replicate itself, or can it use its own code to do more sophisticated things? Okay, so we have to, I mean, I know it sounds very vague, but we'll do some examples. And as I said, it's going to be confusing 10 lines of code, but you know, it's kind of, you just have to stare at it a little bit longer. All right. So first, let's set up some notation to what it means to say can access its own code. What I really want is the following. So recall that, so suppose we have a Turing machine M. Okay, you can think of a Turing machine, any program. It's actually much nicer to talk about Turing machines here instead of programs, because you know each programming language has some has its own perks, which make things a little bit messier actually, right? And we also said that every Turing machine at the end of the day is representable as a binary string, right? So it corresponds to a binary string, which is the code of the Turing machine. So this is just a binary string. It's a string of zeros and ones. Okay? And so here's a question. Can we run M on itself? Can a machine take its own code as input? Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, right? You know, we've been doing that all along. In the definition of toddler function, also we did that. Okay. Okay. Well, actually, let me write it this way. Yes, we can without any issues. By issues, I mean it's a well-defined operation, right? I have the machine, I can plug into it any input, and here I'm plugging in the bit string corresponding to the machine, right? But now suppose I want to say, let me modify this question a little bit. Can M compute So I give you the program, you run its instructions, and it needs to figure out what its own code is, right? So imagine if you're a virus, you're living, but at some point you have to make a copy of yourself. So you have to compute your own code. And can a machine do it? If I give it as the input, you can do whatever with it. You can process it, you can replicate it, whatever, right? But if I don't give it any input, can I produce my own code? Okay. So let me ask. Can there be a program M that on empty input produces the code of M as output? Okay. Can we have such programs? Can some machine, not every machine probably, some machine access its own code? And there is a name for these. These are called quines. A program which can print itself. You run the program, the output is exactly whatever the text lines that went into the program were. Okay. There's a website for those things. You can look it up in every language. There is a quine. You can write a quine in Java. You can write a quine in HTML. With CSS, you can write a quine in C, Python, whatever you want. Okay. All right. So let's try. What we're going to show is that you can indeed do such a thing, and it is not like outrageously complicated to do such a thing. If you work from some first principles, you can indeed do it. Okay. So let's make first attempt, right? Let me so this is, as I said, so we want to say imagine a program can access its own code. Okay. Suppose every program can access its own code, meaning its own binary representation. If I gave you this power, how can you write a program which prints itself? If I told you that you can obtain your own code, then I want to say that it's easy to write a program which prints itself. How? Well, you can do something silly, like let me say this is self-replicator of X. And what it first does is, let's say, obtain self-replicator. Okay. Somehow, if I gave you this mythical power that you can obtain your own code, okay, then you just get that code and then print it out. Write W on tape and halt. Okay. This is again a silly solution, right? What does it mean to say obtain your own code? That's, you kind of just punted the ball to this. This is not good at all, right? How do you implement this step? Okay. And this is exactly what the Kleen's recursion theorem allows us to do. Okay. So let me be precise. I'd say it's more sort of unbelievable than confusing that something like this is true, but hold on to it. Okay. So what does Kleen's recursion theorem say? It says something like the following. Suppose we have some Turing machine, okay, T, which takes two inputs. Okay. Suppose you have some Turing machine T which takes two inputs and produces some output. If it's convenient, you can imagine the function T always holds. That's also fine. Okay. It's interesting in all cases. Just take any Turing machine which does this. But we'll work under the interpretation that this function T views its first argument as a program. Okay. So this is code of a Turing machine. Okay. And the second input can be anything. All right. We've seen examples of functions like this. Can you tell me one function which looks like this, which has two arguments, views the first argument as some code of a program, and then does something with it? Eval, right? So that's an example. So for example, if I say eval, says run M on W and hop, and that's it. Okay. You can also imagine all kinds of other stuff, right? You know, maybe you'll say eval half. Run. So when I give it as input M comma W, you do first run M on first half W, then run M on second half, and whatever else you want, right? So you can define all such programs. It doesn't really matter what they're doing. We're just saying this is some transformer which has two inputs. The first is a program and the next is anything that it does with it. Like any compiler would be such a thing, right? It takes a program, input, and executes it and does something. So far, it just seems like we introduced a lot of notation for no real reason. But here's the kicker. What Kleen showed was the following. Kleen's recursion theorem says the following. For any P as above, okay, given any P as above, we can find a Turing machine R, let me not use R, let me say K for Kleen, such that, so K is a Turing machine, so it takes an input and produces some output, okay? But its behavior is exactly the following. It's going to mimic the behavior of P, all right? But when T is run with the code of K as the first argument. Okay, so there is some Turing machine K which mimics the behavior of T on the code of K. Okay. So if you think about it, what this is saying is K is a Turing machine which is doing some computation with its own code. It can access its own code and then do some other processing with it and then be done with it. Okay. It's not saying that every K satisfies it. That would not be true. But there is some Turing machine K for which this sort of magical and, to me at least, very implausible statement is true. That the machine K mimics the behavior of T after accessing its own code. Yeah?
It's not just a construct. It's not just a reduction. We're taking a T and saying that it's
so it's not exactly that, right? Because if you think about it, it's a very circular, seemingly circular statement, right? Because the functionality of K involves the code of K. Okay, so it's very confusing. It's the functionality of K involves the code of K. Okay. If it were some other machine, you can say, okay, I'm just mimicking, just applying some other machine on W. Okay. But it's saying this is a program whose behavior is exactly what would happen if T took this program and did something else. Yeah?
If T were eval, that wouldn't this be true?
If T were eval, yeah. Yeah, so for some T's, this is trivial. For some T's, it's quite non-trivial. Okay, yeah? Yeah, so that's an excellent point. So example, if T were eval, the self-recursion statement is true for all machines. Okay. Okay, just as a tautology, with the way we define eval was to satisfy this equation. Okay, so for some T's, this is a non-trivial statement. For some T's, it's a very powerful statement. But the amazing thing is that Kleen's recursion theorem says it's true for any T. Okay, so let's look at an example of this, right? So this is, okay, so let's do another example. Example application. Okay. So you get to define any T you want, and then Kleen's recursion theorem gives you a machine which does something. Okay. So here's an example application. I'm going to define T as the following. It's a seemingly silly machine which ignores the second input and just prints out the first input. Okay? Whenever I run T on two inputs, it ignores the second input and prints the first input. That's all it's doing, nothing else. Okay? That's the, I mean, that seems as simple a Turing machine as you can imagine, right? Just ignore the second input, print the first input, nothing else. Now, what happens if I apply Kleen's recursion theorem to this machine, T? If I apply Kleen's recursion theorem to T, what do I get? Any guesses? You get a self-replicator, right? Why? So let's apply Kleen's recursion theorem to the above T. What does this say? There exists some machines K such that for all W, K of W equals the code of K comma W, which is just the code of K. Okay. So Clean's recursion theorem is saying if I plug in this trivial function or seemingly simple function T into the theorem, I immediately get as a corollary a self-replicator. Okay. So this theorem is actually constructive, meaning you give me the code for T, I am going to write down 20 more lines, and that's going to be the code for K, and that will satisfy this equation. Okay. And if I plug in that, what it's saying is I get the code for some machine which on any input produces its own code. Okay. So this means that K is a self-replicator. Okay. This makes sense? So this is just to illustrate the power and confusing aspect of Clean's recursion theorem, right? So another way to think about it is so what is K doing? So what does the machine K do on input W, right? So one way to interpret this is it really does obtain its own representation, run T K comma W, okay, or let's say execute. So in our original definition of self-replicator, you just had to obtain your own code and print it, right? But Clean's recursion theorem gives you this much more power, right? It says not only can the program obtain its own representation, but it can also do much more processing afterward. Okay. So not only are we accessing our own code, but we can also post-process. Okay. So we are not going to be able to prove Clean's recursion theorem, right? But we will prove a corollary of it, and the main proof is just like, maybe another lecture on top of this corollary. But I wanted to give you some insight into what this magical theorem is, right? Any program, not any program, but some programs can access their own code and do subsequent processing on them. All right. Okay. And this is called self-recursion because the program K is kind of recursing and doing something on its own code. Okay. So let's maybe do so we will not prove KRT. Okay, but we will construct a self-replicator. All right. So what do I mean? We are going to see the construction of a Turing machine self, which takes some input and produces its own code, such that for all W, the output of self is the code of self itself. Okay, and there are tons of applications of Clean's recursion theorem. In fact, you can prove the uncomputability of halting problem for it. You can prove Gauss incompleteness theorem from it. You can prove there's something in programming languages called Y Combinator, not the startup company, but in Lisp you might have heard of it. That again comes back to Clean's recursion theorem. All the functional programming languages, they exploit this sort of self-recursion, and it's very powerful. But today what we're going to do is kind of just to understand this theorem, this notion of self-recursion, where a program can access its own code and then do something on top of that, right? So imagine you're a virus, you can access your own code and then not only replicate, but maybe do some processing on it to make it better, right? That's happening in some way or the other. Okay, so in the remaining time today, we'll just address this corollary and then we'll wrap up. Okay, so let's take a 5-minute break, and when we come back, we'll see how to design a Quine Turing machine, that is a Turing machine which prints its own code. Okay. Okay, so let's get started again. So what's our goal? We're trying to solve this question of coming up with a Turing machine which prints its own code, right? We've done designing Turing machines many times before, but this is somewhat special. I mean, it also seems a little bit ad hoc, like why we are doing this, but the reason I'm doing this is to, it's an interesting corollary of Clean's recursion theorem, and the actual proof of KRT very much goes along the same lines. You just need to add one more layer on top. Okay. So any ideas on how I can write a program which prints itself? So imagine you are starting from scratch. I just told you, write a program which prints itself. What would be the first thing you do? Like, listen, Python, C, Turing machine. Actually, I think in Turing machine it's even easier because the language bloat is less. Yeah.
Did you open the program file and print it?
Right, but think of a Turing machine, right? So when you say open a program file and print it, you really relegated all of that to the compiler, right? The compiler is the one which is opening the file. But if you put that, copy paste that code here, then it's not going to be the same, right? You have to import something and then do it from there. Okay. So when you say open the file, there is some code which is doing that, but that code is not being printed. What else? Any suggestions? Like, where would you start from, right? Well, let's start with something, basic, which is, I'm going to call this for any string W, for a string W, I'm going to specify a program PW, and the only thing that the program does is it just prints out W. Okay, that prints W. So what do I mean? So PW is the program which, arrays the input, write W on the tape, and halt. Okay, it is not carrying out these steps, right? PW is the program which does these things. It's the Turing machine which does these things. Okay? So there's a difference. We're not carrying these instructions out. I'm just writing down the program which does these things. Okay? All right? Simple enough. Now comes the next sort of twist. I want to say that there exists a Turing machine which we'll call it Castor. Okay, maybe that's too confusing. So let's just call it Q for now. Okay, what does this machine do? It takes a W as input and produces P of W on its output. Okay, you should think of it as some kind of casting machine, right? You know when you print things. Okay, not anymore, but back in the old days, you'd make these casts, right? Stereotypes or stereo plates, where once you make the plate, you can keep printing it and get copies, right? So PW is something like that. Whenever I call one PW, I get a copy of W. Okay, and what this machine Q is doing is takes W and gives you code of a machine which will always print W. Okay, so I mean, when I say it verbally, it's a bit more confusing, but basically what it's saying is Q is a machine that takes a string as input and outputs a program that prints the string. Okay, should really think of it as some kind of molder which generates casts, right? You give me a design template, I'm going to make a mold for it for you, which you can use from now on. Okay, does the definition make sense? Okay, and my claim is that this function Q can be easily computed by a Turing machine. Why? Well, I'll just say the following. Q does the following. Let me write it on pseudocode. So whatever we had here, right? Okay. Let me try one more time. Okay, it's generating these machines which would print W. Okay. Now, there are two ways to think about the self-replicator. So in our definition, in our construction, we are going to use this Q just as an intermediate, like some kind of sub loop or like a function call. But you'll see the actual construction is not too specific to how Q is implemented. So self will have two parts, which I'll call A and B. Okay. If you think of the machine self is going to be concatenation of two machines, meaning first A will run and then B will run, and the output will be something. Okay. So imagine you're just stacking the two lines of code one after the other. First A will run and then B will run. Each will have its own function. Okay. So A does something, passes its input to B, and B then produces the output. Okay. And what should the output be? It should be the code of AB. Right? So our goal is, we've broken up the machine self into two parts, A and B. The output should be the code of the two things put together. All right? And roughly speaking, the intuition is that somehow B is going to produce A and B. Okay? And A's role is going to give B as input. Hold on. So that's, again, as I said, it's going to be, you probably have never seen 5 lines or 10 lines, which are confusing, but we'll go over them one line at a time. Okay. So let me first specify what this machine B is. So B is the following machine. I'm going to just specify its input output behavior. It takes any string as input, which it views as the code M, and what it produces as output is okay. So what B is going to do is it takes any string as input, it views itself as a machine, then it writes down the program P with the string M plugged in, right? Now what does PM do? On any input, it just produces M as output, and then that output is passed on to M itself. Okay? So it's never running anything, it's just computing the code of this machine. All right. So B does the following, which is okay, so maybe let me move this down a little. Okay. So B is mimicking the following behavior. First run Q on M to compute PM, right? What does PM do? It's just a program which on any input produces M as output, right? The code for M. And then it's saying, let me break it up into one more step. run PM. Pass output to M. Okay, so this is a new Turing machine I'm defining. Okay, but what is B actually doing? B is only producing the code for this Turing machine. Okay, so on any input M, I'm defining a new Turing machine which does these 4 steps, and B's role is to produce the code for this new Turing machine, right? So imagine I give you a function f and I ask you to output the code for another function which computes like a, maybe let's say f of f, right? So that's what B is doing. It takes a program, outputs another program. What is the new program that's being output? It does these 4 steps. Okay? Any questions about this? Yeah? Yeah, exactly. Right. So it's an excellent point. So essentially, you should think of all of them as running on the same tape. Right. So P of M runs and then it leaves something on the output. What does it leave? It leaves the code of M here. Okay. And then you switch the control to M and then you run M. No, not yet. Well, so far, B is just outputting some program, right? We didn't describe what's the code for B. If you run it, if you execute it, it's going to be M of M, but B is not running anything. It's just writing down these 4 lines. Okay? This code is the output, exactly. Right? So B is not executing anything. It's writing down the code, these lines essentially. Okay? It's only producing a text as output. Yeah? Well, we have to, in the code for B, how is it going to get P of M? Yeah, so I mean, it's just a shorthand, right? I could have just copied like, these lines over here too. I'm just using that as shorthand because we'll use it again in a little bit. Okay? Yeah?
Right, like the output B, like fascination, that's statements.
Yeah, exactly. But it's running P of M, then passing the output to M, and it's outputting the code of the machine which would do this.
B outputs these 4 lines of text.
Yeah. So B outputs these 4 lines of text, but what does this 4 lines of text denote? It's a Turing machine, right? And what does this Turing machine correspond to? It's the PM followed by M. Okay, so these 4 lines is the program. It's a good question. So it's this program, right? And what we're outputting is the encoding of that program. Okay. So the confusing thing here is that you're not really running anything. You're just outputting a program which we could potentially run. Okay. There's a question, doesn't Q output the code for PM instead of the machine? Yeah, so first Q outputs the code for PM and then you can execute PM and then you pass the output to M and then you run M. Okay. Or if you think about it, what we're really doing is outputting the code for this particular machine. that would run PM on any input and then take the output of that and run M on that output. Yeah?
So the code that's output doesn't actually run the user.
Yeah, so I mean, it's basically I have to copy those lines here. Right? Okay. So another way to think about it is, what does this machine remark? What does the machine compute? Okay. Suppose I gave it some input W, what would happen? Right. So you would first run the first machine, which would give M as output, and then you would run M on it. Right. So what it's computing is M of M, but that's not really the main point here, right? So in some sense, you can think B takes M as input and writes down the code of as output. Okay, it is self-contained. There is no circularity here. It just takes any program and then outputs the code for another program built on top of this program. Okay, it's well defined. We didn't do anything circular or anything nasty like that. All right. So B is a fixed program. All right. Any questions? It's a well-defined program. I can write it down and then you can run it. Now, what is A going to be? All right. Okay. So A is going to be the program which we defined B already, right? It's a fixed thing. It has some 10 lines of code. Okay. So what does A do? It outputs. So we're going to take A to B. PB. Okay. So there is some program which always outputs the code for this fixed program B. Okay. And then I'm going to put B here. What's going to come? So this is self. So imagine I ran PB on some input W. What would you get? The code for B, right? Because PB is just is a program which just outputs the code for B. It just prints B, right? PW is a program which on any input just prints W, right? So no matter what the input is, you're just plugging in B here. Okay. And what does B do on any input? B was doing this, right? So recall B. B does this, but if I'm passing here, what would I get as output? Well, just use the output behavior, right? Okay. So I'm running PB, I'll get B, which I pass to B, and then I get the output, which is the code for PB concatenated with B. Okay, so what happened here is, now what is self? Who am I? I'm sure pretty much everyone is in that zone now, which is you're all wondering, who am I, where am I, how am I? But okay, so let's get a little introspective. So what is self? Self is a concatenation of two machines, right? It does once A and then followed by B. So what is self is PB followed by B. Okay, and the output is exactly the code for the machine which does PB followed by B, which is self. Okay, so intuitively what's happening here is B takes any machine M and does some processing for its output. It produces the code of a machine which takes PM followed by M. That's what it's doing. It's well defined. You can define it in any favorite programming language. You just have to write it down. Okay. Now, if you could plug in B directly, then we would be done. But B cannot access its own code. It wasn't part of it to begin with, right? But now A's role was to provide this input to B. Okay. So this is a little bit like this. Okay, so maybe it's really analogous to the following. Consider the commands okay. So consider the following command sequence, right? Print the next sentence twice, the second time in quotes, right? So what are quotes signifying? Quotes signifies sentence, right? Versus a command. It's saying the sentence is print the next sentence twice, the second time in quotes. To run this, what would you get? The same thing as output, right? I say print the next sentence twice, the second time in quotes, but the second time is already in quotes. If I execute it, what you get is exactly the same, right? Yeah? So it's just like concatenation means that I first run piece of B, and then whatever is left on the tape, I'm running B now. Okay, so I didn't want to say you're starting from scratch. Let's say it's not as if you're starting from scratch. Imagine if you think of them as program lines, I'm just taking the output of PB so far and then passing it along to B. Okay, in Turing machines, you're just changing the controller but keeping the tape condition as is. All right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so people have done it. The only annoying thing, if you want to do it in Python directly, is that Python doesn't have this persistence. Somehow when I write a function, there's a difference between printing the function and the return value of the function. Okay, so that's the only reason why it's a little hairy to do it. But if you define like a global variable called tape, which is meant to kind of hold the global state, then everything would work. Okay. In fact, the good thing here is that this is not at all specific to the idiosyncrasies of the language, right? So you'll see all kinds of coins written in C where you say, okay, %, %, %, and all kinds of hacks like that. But this trick, this sort of methodological way can be used in any programming language. It's especially clean in Lisp, where you can write down a self-replicator in 4 lines, because that really has this kind of lambda notation built in to define functions, so it just works beautifully there. But you can use it to get a Quine pretty much in any Turing complete programming language. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
So when you're running something that just like gives you a program that
Right.
or like the source
Mm-hmm.
right? But then you say like ask output to the Turing machine and then model. Like what does that mean?
Yeah, so actually let me explain that. I think that's maybe wasn't very clear. So, so let's say clarification. When I say something like this, okay? So imagine this is some Turing machine, right? Okay, actually let me do it for, so let's say CD here means this is some Turing machine, okay? And you can imagine there is a tape, right? So you start out with the input initially input to C, okay? Now you run C, okay? And once C finishes, the tape is in some state, right? So the tape has some output on it. Maybe it has like, say something here, and then here, and then the head is somewhere here. But this is the output of C. The tape is in some state. Okay. So for instance, if I ran PM, then the tape would have the code for M on itself. Right? It leaves the tape in some state. And now when I say run D, pass the output to D means run D with the current with the tape left by C as input to D. Okay. So far I first do all the operations with respect to C. Once C finishes, the tape has some things. I move the head all the way to the left, and then I start running D with that as the input. Okay. So imagine you're basically like running 2 programs one after the other. So it's 2 function calls. I first compute C, I get some output, and then I pass that output to D and run D. Okay. Does it make sense? So I'm switching the controller to D and then running it from now on. Yeah? Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Colon is just meant to say that it's being continued below the line. Oh, so that's yeah, so this colon, this sort of concatenation is meant to say that you just run A and then pass the output of A to B. Okay? It's like concatenating 2 program files, right? Once you run one file and then followed by the second file. Okay? You have some global variables, which is the tape, and then you first run the first file and then the second file. Okay? Yeah? Yeah. So you're going to run M on M, right? But the output of B is not doing that. It's just returning the code of the machine which would do that. So there's a difference, right? So B's output is this program, it's not actually computing M on M. It's just outputting a program which would run M on M and give the output. Okay?
How that makes it software.
Okay, so let's follow this logic again, right? So we define A as PB. B is a fixed program. You know, you can write it down in your favorite language. In fact, people have done this in Python and other languages, but it gets somewhat tedious, so I didn't do it here. But you know, A is PB, right? And then I follow that with B, right? So I'm saying self equals PB concatenated with B, meaning you first run PB, whatever output you get, you pass it to B, and then whatever output you get is your final output. Okay, I have two machines, you know, first run A and then run B. When I run A, what is the output? It's the code for B, right? Because that's how A works. Now, what happens when I run B? It's going to output the code for PM concatenated with M, right? That's what B does always. Given any code for a machine, it just outputs PM concatenated with M, the code for that machine. Okay? So the code, the output is going to be PB followed by B, but that's exactly what self is. Okay? And it is mysterious as to why it's working. And part of the explanation is this sentence. It's saying print the next sentence twice, the second time in quotes. Okay? And this output of B is a little bit like that. Print the next sentence twice, the second time in quotes. So run it, you're just going to get the same thing as output again. Okay? Any questions? So let me summarize. So B is the machine that does the following. Right, so let me draw a diagram to make it clear. On any M as input, it's going to produce the code for this machine. Okay, yeah? How?
I was wondering if B is equivalent to K.
What, sorry, say that again.
PB,
Mhm.
B is equivalent to K.
Yeah, sort of, yeah. The actual, I mean, this is a simpler version. Like if you want to do Keen's recursion theorem, you follow the same thing where you have A, B, and then you do another control switch to the function T, but you know, it's along the same lines. Okay, so B is this machine, and then we are defining self as PB concatenated with B. That's it. We define a Turing machine B which does this processing, and then our self-replicator is the machine which runs PB and then B. Yeah? Yeah, so once it self-replicates, you can do other stuff with it, right? In fact, if you think of the proof of the Keen's recursion theorem, you can try and do something like that now, right? So going from here to the proof of KRT is not too complicated, but you know, you'll have to do something like what you said, which is, okay, now I have a machine which can self-replicate. On top of that, now I can try and simulate T. Okay, but there's still some kind of, you know, hairy detail there, which is, you know, you have to mimic the final behavior, not just the intermediate behavior, but you can do it by kind of following this logic. Okay. Yeah.
So should we consider A as like a form of processing to get to self, or also part?
So in some sense, A is providing the missing ingredient, right? So it is providing the code of B to itself, right? But if I just do it and then make B output its code, then I'm losing something, right? Because I won't have A, right? So B is doing something clever, which is it kind of looking ahead and saying, I'm not just going to output my own code, like whatever the input is, I'm going to output, like kind of put something in front, which is code for A. Okay. All right. So, I mean, that's actually a good point. Like somehow B, what it does is it takes its input, right? It outputs the code for A and the input. And what B A is doing is providing the missing piece to B to get the self-replication done. All right. So, I mean, as I said, you know, this is just, in terms of definitions, it's not complicated, but to understand why it works is always confusing, right? Because it's just these 5 lines, but somehow magically now we have a self-replicator. Okay? And claim for all W. Right, and we proved that here. So what's the proof? You kind of follow along the execution. Once I run PB on W, I get B, and I run it through B, I just get that. Okay. And as I said, you know, you can, this is, you know, we said that this is a corollary of Kleen's recursion theorem, but the actual proof also kind of follows the same logic, but we're not going to prove it in this, like, in this course. Right. So let me say, in summary, we saw how to get a self-replicator. And so KRT, you know, says that not only can a machine print itself, but it can actually process its own code in arbitrary ways. Okay, so not only can you just access your own code and print it out, but you can do whatever you want with that code. So there's a question in the chat, which is, can you explain again why PB concatenated with B is self? So we are defining self to be this program, and the claim is that it satisfies the properties that we want, right? So we are defining self to be the machine PB followed by B, and the claim is that that machine satisfies the self-replicator property that we were shooting for at the beginning. Okay? All right. Okay. So with that, let me stop this discussion and maybe just any questions about this? You can implement this in your programming languages. There are some implementations in Python, but as I said, it's much easier and clearer in Lisp or other functional programming languages, which allow for passing of arguments between functions in a nice way. Okay. All right. So let me finish with a quick summary of the course. I mean, we started a long time ago with many things, eons ago. But the first thing we started out with is that world is just binary, right? You might think that there are so many different kinds of inputs, but everything is just a binary string. it's an abstraction, but it's also very helpful. And we don't lose much in this abstraction because of our abilities to build new representations and encodings from older ones. Okay. And then we kind of introduced this model, our first model, which was Boolean circuits. And the good thing about that was it's a powerful enough model for finite computation, and it is actually the one that corresponds to physical devices. Okay, so if you think of a physical computer, the first ones you should think of are Boolean circuits. And when we're talking about Boolean circuits, we also looked at this very important concept, which is equivalence of computational models. Right? We had NAND circuits and OR circuits, but both were equivalent. Meaning, if there is a NAND circuit for something, there was a Boolean circuit for the same thing. And with somewhat similar complexities, right? So this notion of equivalence, again, is something not just specific to Boolean circuits. This definition is very useful across many different kinds of models. But, Boolean circuits had a problem, which was that they were finite computation, and we went beyond that by looking at DFAs, right? So this really captured the notion that algorithm should be a single answer for an infinite number of questions, right? Not just a finite input length, but many things. And there we studied many properties of DFAs, like closure properties, limitations of regular languages, and many things. But I'd say one of the main highlights of DFAs should be the notion of non-determinism in computation. And the fact, perhaps surprising fact, that non-determinism can also be simulated in a deterministic world. Okay? It is a useful abstraction to reason about things and build algorithms, but you can also circumvent it if you need it to be. Okay? And finally, we got to the real highlight of the course, which are Turing machines, which Turing introduced in 1936. It's a single model which we believe is complete for all models that we believe are possible in the physical world, right? So if you think of quantum computing, yes, they are also simulated by Turing machines. If you think of relativistic computers, whatever they are also simulatable by Turing machines. People have built models of computing based on what are called closed time loops. They're also simulatable by Turing machines and all kinds of crazy things, right? And this led to the Church-Turing thesis, which we think which makes Turing machines the model to study, right? And while talking about Turing machines, we also once again revisited this idea of code being data and data being code. Meaning a program is just a binary string. We can feed the program as input to other programs, which can then do whatever they were doing with just binary strings. And this led to the notion of general purpose computing or universality. There's a single Turing machine with like 24 states, which can simulate anything, right? So if you wanted to take a blueprint of a computer, all you need is this single computer, and then it's just software on top of that, right? And code as data, of course, kind of crushed many of our hopes for solving all kinds of computational problems, like, can I find bugs in an automated way? Can I check equivalence of programs in an automated way? Can I predict when I'm going to get code dump errors in an automated way? None of those are possible. In fact, it's so bad that basically programs cannot do any introspection. They cannot answer any question which is non-trivial about programs. This was Weiss's theorem, which is very far-reaching, right? It's just saying any property that you care about, as long as it's non-trivial, you just cannot compute it. Okay? It was not specific to one or two things. Any property is impossible to be solved. And then, of course, there's GFIT, which is no one is sound and complete and effective, I should say. No one is sound, complete, and effective at the same time. Okay? By one, I mean really no machine, no system is sound, complete, and effective. So this chicken and egg question of what is truth if you don't have a proof, you just cannot answer it. You can't say, okay, here are my rules, and then every truth must just follow from these things. That's never going to work. And just today, we saw this concept of self-replicating machines exist. And it's actually much more, as I said, the Kleen's recursion theorem can in fact be used to get uncomputability, universality, and many, many other things as well. But we are just saw one corollary of it. And this notion of self-recursion is very powerful because it helps you to get recursion even if your language doesn't actually support it directly. So you can now write Turing machines which are recursive. They can talk about their own code, they can run their code on something else, and so on and so forth. Okay? So if you had to take a few things, I'd say the second half of the course is really loaded with some of the highlights of computer science. The first half, again, is very important as well, but kind of as a lead up to conceptually more revolutionary part is from the second half. Okay? So that's all for us, and I'll see you all on Monday in the exam. And the exam will only cover the last 6 lectures. All right, bye everybody.